And I am here with the returning guest, Mr. Mike Chen. Now, Mike came on the podcast back in May 2024, episode 234, and we spoke about Star Wars Brotherhood, as well as some of Mike's other works as well. Since then, I have read A Quantum Love Story, which any watchers on YouTube will be able to see in the background, as well as Mike's other book, Star Wars Brotherhood. But this conversation, we're talking about a book which comes out tomorrow as of recording this, but about 6 days ago as of releasing this. So when you're listening to this, the book will already be out, so there's no excuse not to go get it. And it is What If Marc Spector Was Host to Venom, which is a combination of two of my favourite characters in all of Marvel. In fact, again, the watchers will be able to see. I have a Funko Pop of Mr. Knight and also a Venom. I also have a Venomized Groot down there. And so I'm a massive Moon Knight and Venom fan. And you and I, Mike, we actually spoke about this book quite a bit in our last conversation as a nice little tease. So hello there, good sir. Thank you for joining me once again. Let's just delve straight in. No worries. It's been a delight. I said before recording, I got an advanced reader copy, which is amazing. I've read about a third of it because I've had it for about a week. And so it kind of works because then I won't accidentally spoil the book for the listeners. But it's all about Venom and Moon Knight. So if we delve straight into what were your first memories of Venom and Moon Knight? And linking with that, did you ever consider the two of them connected in any way, like the duality, the inner voice, that kind of thing? Baton to you.
So I'll answer that last question first. No, which is why when this was pitched to me, I was like, wow, that's amazing. And how has no one ever done that before? So my first memory of Venom, so I was a teenager in the 90s. And I was reading X-Men, Punisher was my favorite, and then some other like indie comics. But I remember when Venom happened, and it was like in middle school, it was like the thing to talk about. It was like, Cable and X-Force was part of like, the conversation, but then it was also like Spider-Man has a black suit, and then unraveling like why that happened. So that's like I always associate Venom with that time, just like the excitement about it. And back then it was before digital comics and before a lot of like trade paperbacks would come out with collections. So getting like the new issue of Spider-Man, with Venom and figuring out who Venom was, like it was like it sold out quick. I will shout out my local cigarette-smelling comic shop called Comics and Fantasies on Meridian Avenue in San Jose, where I would go there and like the cranky old shop owner would be like, no reading in the store. And so, you had to buy your stuff and pull out quick. But yeah, that's like my main association with Venom. And then with Moon Knight, I saw this question in advance and I was trying to think about it because Moon Knight is one of those characters that like I never really thought about, but I encountered him in video games, and I was like trying to remember like where was it first? I'm like, was it their stuff in like the 16-bit era or the arcade era? And like, no, I figured it out. So in the PS2 era, there was a company, I forget the company, but they made X-Men Legends and X-Men Legends 2, and it was a fantastic action RPG. And it had Patrick Stewart doing all of the Xavier voice work. It was really, really good. And like it went everywhere in like the X-Men lore. And they made a follow-up game for PS3 called Marvel Ultimate Alliance. And that was my first encounter with Moon Knight.
Wow, that's crazy. Because the funny thing is with Moon Knight, my friend Scott, so shout out to Scott Weatherly, he wrote, again, people watching will be able to see, an essay collection called Waxing and Waning by Sequart. Now that is That's Scott. There's loads of other individuals. A couple who've been on the show doing essays about Moon Knight. So I'd read some Moon Knight. I knew a bit about him, but I knew him from like Top Trumps I used to play quite a lot. And then Venom I knew from the Spider-Man games on PS1. I remember Spider-Man swinging and then Daredevil and Venom showing up. And I was like, that guy looks cool. Especially when you're a young kid or anything, you're like, that is the cool, Spider-Man with giant teeth and cool and giant and muscly. And then playing like the Ultimate Spider-Man games and things like that. And Venom, I think, has just become such a huge part of the Spider-Man consciousness. It's almost impossible not to know who Venom is if you just even vaguely know who Spider-Man is. Yeah. And so with Moon Knight, because Scott did the essay collection with loads of other individuals, I knew bits and pieces and I read some of it. But then I was like, thanks to Digital Comics and Marvel Unlimited, I was just like, let's go. And I basically just did all the big hits of Moon Knight. And I did the same with Venom. So I'd read quite a lot of Venom comics. But once I got Unlimited, I was like, let's do it. Let's go from square one.
Marvel
Let's go
Unlimited
all
is
the way
pretty
through.
amazing.
It is.
They gave that to me as part of, like, as being an author. They're like, okay, here's like a gift membership, use this for your research. And I'm like, this is like every comic ever made. Like, I'm thinking about, like, how do I explain this to my teenage self that would go to comics and fantasies and be really pissed off because, like, I remember when, like, the 2099 series came out, and it was like there was Spider-Man 2099, and then I think there was like Punisher 2099, and they were like, very futuristic at the time, and so it was like the thing that everyone wanted. And if you did not get there within a few hours of release time, it was completely sold out there. And it, like, my mom was like working that afternoon, then like I just couldn't go, and I just couldn't get it.
It's the thing with, like, it's the parallel to streaming as well, because I remember, when you watch episodes of stuff on TV, like you used to watch Buffy or whatever,
Yeah.
and then you miss a week or you miss a time and you just don't know what happened, and you've just had to hope that the episode will repeat, and if it doesn't, you just don't know. And as with comics, so many of my friends, reading comics and then you miss an issue, or you just pick up a random, especially Spider-Man, it's on Amazing Spider-Man like 1300 or something nuts, and so it's like trying to coherently find that is so hard. But then with streaming, it's like, here's basically everything. And with with Marvel Unlimited, it's basically, here's it all. And also, you want to know everything about Carnage, because I don't feel like a Carnage like dark hole, so I just read all the Carnage appearances all the way from the 90s sort of I can't remember what it's called. It's from the N64 game, but when Carnage basically took over, and it was like I think it was like a 17 issue crossover event where Absolute Carnage, there we go, that was the name, I think. But linking actually with that, because I do want to ask about the book, but I do want to quickly ask, who is your favorite symbiote and host, either with or without Venom? Like, I love Carnage, don't get me wrong. I know that you really appreciate the 2018 Kate's Venom run, but for me, my favorite Venom host is actually Flash. I really liked the Agent Venom stuff, even though it's not very Venomy. I wonder what yours was.
I'm a bit of a traditionalist like this, and I will say, like, before this I was more of like just kind of a casual Venom fan. Like, so like I knew, it's like, oh, there's Eddie, there's Dylan, there's like when there's Null, and like it goes off and different things. But like I my main jam in terms of like Marvel, like my absolute favorites are like classic X-Men and the Punisher. So like I know their stuff like much more than like I did with Venom. And so because of that, I think I just like the relationship between Eddie and Venom. Like, I like how it evolves. And that's, we can talk about more later, but like the Kate's run, I think, is a really good grounding of both who Venom is, like, and also like what the hive mind is, but also the relationship with Eddie. And at that point, they go through things in that run, and you see how they affect each other. And I thought that was a really good starting point for this book.
Yeah, well, let's delve straight in. So you've got Moon Knight and Venom, and so why don't you tell us like a little, like, the elevator pitch from your perspective of this book itself? Why would someone want to pick up this book? I've got my thoughts, but you're the author.
It's Moon Knight and Venom.
I was going to say, that's what my answer was going to be.
Okay, that's the simple version. But so I have debated like how much to spoil, but I feel like the promotional copy and like the back cover copy like kind of gives this away. So I think it's okay to say. So the idea that Marc Spector is host to Venom. So you have Mark, you have Steven, you have Jake, you have Khonshu, and then you have Venom. So theoretically 5 voices in one body. And so the interesting pitch is like, well, how are you going to make that happen? And the trick that we came up with is we split them. So it goes multiversal. And so you have one body that is Steven and Jake trying to figure out what the hell's going on without Mark, which is the really, really interesting thing. And then you have Venom basically controlling Mark, but then them trying to like reach this sort of like uneasy, trusting friendship, which really evolves as the story goes on. And so I like to pitch this book as, yes, it's a superhero book. Yes, it's a what if book. And yes, there is a MacGuffin for the story that is a very deep Moon Knight cut from the 90s, Marc Spector Moon Knight run. But ultimately, it's about trust and unlikely friendships, and how these unlikely friendships develop over time, and how you can kind of give yourself to them if you just open your freaking mind.
That's amazing. Yeah, because when I started reading into the book itself, I did notice when you did the split, I was like, that's very clever, because one of the things I think what if stories are really great at is they add more weight to characters you already know.
Mm-hmm.
And although the narrative story beats aren't necessarily consequential, it's still very telling of the characters. And I remember from our last conversation that you said you love those moments in between. And I think we discussed that you're a very character-driven author. You know, that's why, you know, Star Wars Brotherhood, it works so well. You know, it's an important book for the canon, but it's mainly important because the development, it's the bridge between Anakin and Obi-Wan's relationship in Attack of the Clones and where we see them at the start of the Clone Wars. And so although the narrative story is cool, you find out what is that business on Cato Nemoidia, it is really about those two as characters. And I found with like Quantum Love Story, you know, it's two people stuck in a time loop together, which it may have happened somewhere before, but I've not seen it happen except as a twist in a certain film, which I won't spoil. But like, generally that's not from like the get-go, but that story is very much what happens when two people seemingly have almost unlimited time, but there's also a pressure. And so how did you find with those books, especially where each of those books has at least two perspectives as well, you know, Anakin and Obi-Wan, and then the two characters in Quantum Love Story whose names have completely escaped me, and I'm sorry. How was
Mariana and Carter.
There we go. How was writing sort of those two? Was that almost like a soft practice for this? Because as you said, there are five perspectives in this book. You've got Stephen who speaks in I, so first person. You've got Venom who speaks in we, which I think is still kind of first person.
One of the main pitches when I pitched how to separate them, I said, what if we put Venom in second person and he's just yelling at Mark the whole time? And everyone was like, whoa, that's a good idea. And I'm like, yeah, I don't know if I can pull that off, but I'm going to pitch it. And I read N.K. Jemisin, who does second person really, really well. But yeah, like that, so the breakdown is, so Steven is first person, Venom is second person, Mark and Jake are third person, but their voices are a little bit different. And then you just have Khonshu kind of floating around as needed to yell at them in all caps.
100%. And did you find, so the writing of your previous novels, was that like a training ground for this? Because 5 characters and 3 writing in first, second, and third person, that's a lot to deal with. So I'd love to hear about that process.
I think like, so my first book was third person, just a single character. I went ambitious with my second book. It's called A Beginning at the End. It's my pandemic book that came out in January 2020, which was just like the worst marketing of all time. Me and Chuck Wendig and our friend Sarah Pinsker, we all had pandemic books come out in the first half of 2020, and so we joke like, we're sorry, we totally caused this, it's our fault. But that book had 4 points of view, and so that taught me, that book was really interesting because originally it was supposed to be just 2 points of view, and then my agent was looking at the manuscript and he had me read Station 11 by Emily St. John Mandel. And he said, like, I know this is a similar theme with like post-apocalyptic, but I want you to look at how she structured flashbacks and how she structured multiple points of view and how they paced. And so that was really an education for me there. And then with Obi-Wan and Anakin, because that one has 5 perspectives. It's Obi-Wan, Anakin, Mill, the Youngling, Roog, the Nemoidian, and also Ventress gets a few chapters there. So I think like that one is probably the most complex of these, because like everyone had to sound really, really distinct. And so yeah, it was like all of that was kind of like training wheels, because like I hadn't played with they were all third person in all these different works. So this was the first time that I had to consciously write, like, the voice must be different because the perspective is different. And that was challenging at first. Like, I had to write a few test chapters for Venom and then I actually had to send the Random House team, I had to send them some test chapters as Venom, because they like the idea, but they're like, we have to make sure this actually works first. So yeah, that took some practice.
Yeah, I can imagine. Because when I first read, because when I read, I read a lot of Star Wars books, and all of them in canon, bar one, are in third person, excluding some of the short stories. So I generally, and perhaps to contradictory, I actually find I connect with characters more when it's written in third person as opposed to first. When I read certain first person stories, I find I can't connect with them in the same way when I'm hearing their narrative from their perspective, because it feels like someone is sitting me down and talking to me. Whereas when I read third person, I feel like I'm kind of silently observing them. And for me, I don't know, that connects with me more. When I first read the Venom chapter, your writing in it was fantastic, don't get me wrong, but I read it and I was like, okay, I didn't expect this. This is different. Yeah. First person I'm okay with. Third person is my preference. But second, I was like, how is this going to work fully? And I read the first chapter, so that wasn't bad with the Venom parts. And then when there was more, as they develop more, it works. And there's parts where, this isn't a spoiler or anything, but there's a part where I thought you were going to spend ages at a point, and you just went straight through it. And it was something like, oh, they need to get from point A to point B and get something, and then get information, and then go attack this facility.
I know what you're talking about.
And you were just like basically 4 paragraphs, and they're at the facility, and I was like, oh, but it sped across the story quick enough. But then it gave us time for Venom to be speaking to Mark.
Yes, that was very intentional. So the idea is because, like, I was really trying to think about, like, what would it internally be like to have a symbiote? But not just like, so Venom and Mark, like, their partnership really evolves over the course of the book, and you will find that Venom's tone changes. Like, when Venom first comes in, Venom is very much like, I got this shit to do, and so you were going to do this for me. For like reasons that we discover why. Like, there's an external pressure happening to Venom. And so it would make sense that, like, when Venom and Eddie are in a healthy part of their relationship, they're having conversations. But when they're not healthy, there's like a lot of yelling going back and forth. And so I wanted to kind of like take that, but then have it almost be like more military, because Venom is on a mission. Venom's not doing this for fun. So that's where the second person came from. And it evolves as they establish this sort of trust between them. And you'll see that more of like Venom's trademark snark start. Like, it's very intentional that you don't get that much of it at the beginning, because Venom's feeling a lot of pressure to get this thing done. But as they develop a relationship, like, the jokes start to come in there more, to like where I feel like they're around like the midpoint. Like, there's a clear turning point where like you feel like they're more of a team now. And so that, like, once they get there, like, that was really fun to write. Like, when it's just like, because Mark's kind of a dick too, in a good way. And so, but they're doing that with a certain level of trust with each other, and that's fun.
Yeah, and one of the things I really liked is, again, it's sort of the third part through the book, and I think it might be actually the turning point in which you speak of, but there's a point where the facility gets attacked, and you're following the perspective of one of the bodies, so the Steven body, essentially, and you watch, like, them, oh, we need to figure out how to get into this place, and do this, and do that, and then you get the Venom perspective, you're like, they're watching Steve and Jake do all these things. Yeah. And they're the bits where I found, personally, being such a big Moon Knight and Venom fan, I was like, these are the best bits, because you've got Venom realizing and learning this person's a lot more capable, but also the thing that you touched upon earlier, which is Venom at one point, one line to Mark says, oh, you're concerned because you can see how well Jake and Steven are doing without you. Yeah. You've never worried about this before, kind of thing. You've never even considered this was an option. Does this make you feel like you're no longer valuable? And I was like, God, that is, and it's almost throwaway. I think it's going to be developed for it later, but that wasn't the main point of that conversation. He just kind of said that to kind of almost throw Mark a bit off balance.
He's needling.
Yeah, Mark. And I love that bit.
You will see, like, again, as the relationship develops and their brains kind of start to intertwine, and like their memories start to intertwine, Mark needles back, and that's fun.
That's the thing, because a lot of people, and not to insult any listeners or anything, this is a term I use occasionally, but normies of Venom, a lot of them don't realize how funny Venom is. And that's, I think we touched upon it in the last conversation. Like, I enjoy the Venom movies. They're not perfect. Let There Be Carnage, especially the CGI battle at the end, is pretty weak, but I really like those because the relationship between Eddie and Venom is very funny. And a lot of people are like, it's not dark enough. And I'm like, but if you read, especially those 90 comics, you read like Lethal Protector, and you've got Venom swinging through the cities talking about eating brains while singing random songs from like the 60s. And you're like, this is like black comedy almost. And that's why I think the Venom movies do well in a lot of respects. It's probably the highlight of those movies. And so for me, and in the games when he used to interact with Spider-Man, he's quite antagonistic, but he's got no fear to Spider-Man.
The whole time.
He is.
He's like,
exactly. And I love
poking.
that.
Yeah.
It's one of my favorite things about
that's
Venom.
very intentional. And the more that they poke at each other, the more that you can see like they're doing this because they trust each other enough to do it. And so it doesn't start out that way. It starts out with like, I am in charge of you and I am giving you orders, as opposed to like, okay, we're going to figure this out, but I'm also giving you shit about it.
Well, there's probably quite a good line to connect with the What If books. So it's essentially a trilogy of books, but they're kind of marketed somewhat as their own thing, but also connected. Now, I've not read the other two novels, but I know that there's the prologue with America Chavez, and I know from the Doctor Strange Multiverse film, which I actually quite like, a lot of people don't. I enjoy that film. She's like a multiverse jumper. I've not seen her in the comics, to be fully honest. I assume she is one of the connections between the three books. So I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about how the three books connect without spoilers. And did you and Madeline and you and Shannon speak about the sort of connections, or was it more of a separate thing?
So it's not three. It's not just a trilogy. These are the only three that they've been announced. I believe the plan is 5 or 6 parts.
Ooh, that's exciting.
There is a tease at the end of my book for part 4, and I know who is writing part 4. And so, one of the cool things about this is that like every one of the writers involved is really enthusiastic about the characters. And so I talked with the author for book 4, and so she was telling me, she's like, I get to write my favorite blank of all time, and I'm like, that's awesome. So it's like that's what you really need with these IP books, is you need someone who just really loves like the situation and the character and thinks about how to do them justice, and doesn't just treat it like a job, because there's not enough time to just treat it like a job. Like people, if you treat it that way and you don't have that sort of like love of and respect of the lore, you're not going to be able to finish it in time.
Especially a What If story, where you have to intrinsically know the character so well, you know how they'll act in a situation they canonically could never appear in. That's the beauty.
And I know, like, we talked about this a bit with Brotherhood, where I'm like, I wrote faster than I ever did, because like I have Obi-Wan and Anakin in my head like all the time. Like I know exactly how they sound. And like with this, okay, well, we'll talk about Stephen Grant's voice in a little bit, but for your question about like the Watchers. So, the first book is What If Loki Was Worthy, and the second book is What If Wanda and Peter Parker were siblings. And so the Watchers are kind of like this connective tissue, because there is this outside entity that is creating these what if situations, because that entity is seeking this sort of like multiversal power source. It's always a power source.
Multiversal MacGuffin.
Yeah, basically. And so this entity is like conducting experiments, and that creates like the what if books. And then America Chavez is the one who's noticing like, wait a minute, this is happening. This is not good. And the Watchers are just kind of being like, we are watching, we're not interfering. And so progressively through the books, America Chavez starts to like decide to take action. And so what you'll find in my book is like, because we had to write it for fans who are just picking up the book because they love like the Venom films or the Moon Knight series, but also we have to work in like the through line. So there's exposition. I think America gets 3 chapters, like beginning, middle, and end, to kind of like ground like where it is in like the higher, like the meta narrative. So the MacGuffin, like the MacGuffin in each of the books gets tied into like this greater villain, but the story itself stands alone. And so that was really, really important because they said like right away, with like the parameters of this book, it's not MCU. Like, so we can't take anything from the MCU, except I totally stole, Oscar Isaac very, very blatantly. But it has to appeal to MCU fans because like that's like kind of the casual fan that they want to bring into like this romp. So yes, they are connected, but you can enjoy them all individually. If like if you're a big Loki fan, you don't have to read like the Wanda book, or if you love Wanda, you don't have to read the Loki book, like that sort of thing. But you will get more out of it if you read all three in sequence.
Yeah, because I'm going to go back and I'm going to delve into those. I think maybe via Audible or something, because I generally like listening to audiobooks quite a lot, especially because I'm normally reading one or two books at one time and reading comics, and then I've got audiobooks as well all at once.
So for my book, I haven't they haven't given me access to it yet, but I saw that the audiobook listing actually has two different authors, or not two different authors, two different narrators. So I am assuming that they probably broke it up where Stephen in his first person gets one, and then Venom and the third person views probably gets another. Like that, to me, that seems like a logical way to do it. But they're breaking it up somehow, so I think that will be fun to give it more of a performance.
Yeah, that would be very cool. And with these books as well, so one thing I thought of, because, I think Moon Knight and Venom, although there have been the Venom films and now the Moon Knight series, they are characters who live in the comic world the most, and that's how I know them. Now, I haven't seen any Moon Knight or Venom written prose books aside from this one. There probably are a couple out there, but I know that I think you've primarily written novels, books, but you have written a couple of comics, if I'm correct.
Yes, for Star Trek.
Yeah, I thought so. So with this, like, did you have a preference? Like, if they said to you, look, you could have written this as a novel or a comic, would you have still stuck to novel if there was no other outside factors? Just because I know with Venom in particular, and actually with Moon Knight, because there's so much internal monologue from Khonshu or Venom, that a lot of the time the comic format can work because you can have a scene of watching the character do something and Venom's little comment or whatever. I wonder, do you have any of those considerations with writing this novel at all?
I actually think because of these characters, more Moon Knight than Venom. But I think like Moon Knight lends himself to the novel because there's so many voices arguing.
Yeah.
And so you will have these moments, and I'm actually like, for fun, we started rewatching Moon Knight last night, like the MCU series.
I did a few months ago. It's amazing.
Yeah, Oscar Isaac is so good, man.
One of the best actors working today.
But like, there are moments where it's like Steven and Mark just like in the first episode, like they're in the bathroom and they're just arguing. In a novel, like that could just take place as like, dialogue. But if you're doing it visually, you need something else to be happening, but there's no one else around. So like, they had in the MCU, they have the trick of like the reflection. And I thought that was really, really smart, like a way to like ground this in a way so it's not just yelling in Mark's head or Steven's head. But in the novel, like you can do that. Like it's the very nature of the format, like kind of lends itself to that. So I think like if you're doing Moon Knight, like I think you could do a whole series of like Moon Knight, like crime fighting books, like not the more fantastical stuff, but like the more grounded stories. And I think it would really, really work.
Yeah, I agree, because Moon Knight, like, I love some of the Venom stories. I know some of them go crazy and go for, like, Null and all the Symbiote stuff, and some of it's just ground level, but Moon Knight, like, some of the stories, it depends on who's writing it, and Moon Knight varies so much, I know that the linear run, that's probably one that people know the best, I think. It's probably in the top 3, and it's so iconic, and I know that you said in our last conversation it did inspire you in some respects for this. I think the Moon Knight series and the Lemire run, they kind of were potentially 2 of your most inspirations for this. And I found, like, with Moon Knight, he's been so varied. He can fight Egyptian gods, but also he can just fight a psychiatrist who's going after him. But also, and I think that's one of the things that a lot of the Moon Knight fans really like about them, which is not only have you got the dissociative identity disorder element of things with the Egyptian god things, with the Marvel fantastical stuff, but also he's almost like a Daredevil sort of street level fighter. So you've got all these tiers.
That was one of the things, like getting into Mark's head, and I really wanted to present this for people because I have to serve multiple audiences. Like there might be some people who just watched Moon Knight but don't really care for Venom, and vice versa. So there has to be a little bit of exposition for each of them. And with Moon Knight, I wanted to establish that in general, like I think that there's mention about how like Moon Knight like spent some time with like the West Coast Avengers. But in general, he saves that stuff for people like Captain America and Captain Marvel, and all he really cares about is protecting his part of New York. And so that sort of very quick exposition establishes that he's like Daredevil. He is a street crime fighting superhero that occasionally gets pulled into like bonkers shit, but for the most part, is like just trying to protect his neighborhood.
100%. And you mentioned about the voice of Stephen Grant. So let's talk about that a little bit. What do you want to say about that?
So if you read the comics, Stephen Grant is basically like Bruce Wayne. He's kind of boring. He's a billionaire, and like his purpose is to basically fund Marc Spector's operation. So he's like on like the boards of corporations, and like he like had some time as like a movie producer and things like that. I find the MCU version of Stephen Grant way more interesting. And Agreed. A big part of that is Oscar Isaac's performance. It's so like when he snaps into Marc Spector, the characters are so different. It's very much like I don't know if you watched Orphan Black with Tatiana Maslany, but she plays like I think she played a total of like 9 different clones in that but like in general, like there's usually an overlap of like 3 or 4 clones at once, and she plays them all so differently. It was very much like what Oscar Isaac did in Moon Knight. And so I said, like, can I make my Steven like the MCU Steven? And they said, like, well, you can't do it. Like, he can't be a gift shop guy from London. And I said, well, what if I took the like personality traits of the Oscar Isaac Steven, but put him into like comic Steven? And then they said, okay, you can do that because this is the multiverse. Like there's going to be some version of Steven who is like that. So we have Steven who is still a billionaire, still like serves on the boards of like corporations and things like that, but he's just this really neurotic nerd. And so the voice work is very much like the Oscar Isaac voice work. And I get to lean into that in a little bit differently, where like if you imagine Stephen Grant from the MCU, if you gave him $1 billion, like what would he do with that? And like, so I kind of extrapolated that where, oh, it would make sense that he would want to be like a movie producer, but then he's also into Egyptology because he's just kind of like this nerd who has this freedom to like, oh, I get to indulge in this. And that like, as we get deeper into the story, it's fun to have like the other characters call him out on that for just like being a huge dork, and then he tries to justify it for being like, well, what else would you do with this kind of money? Like this is the healthy thing to do is to indulge in learning. So that was a lot of fun to do, and like to really lean into like the Oscar Isaac performance of Steven, even though it's a little bit different from the traditional comic one. And because we have a split between like prime Marc Spector and like this multiverse body that comes in with Steven and Jake, like prime Marc Spector gets to note at some point that like, you're a little bit different from my Steven. What's up with you? So like it covers all of the different bases of like, the different canons that we're kind of acknowledging.
And I think as well with the 3 characters, or the 3 alters of Moon Knight, which is, Mark, Steven, and Jake, you've kind of got Mark is the middle. He is pretty organized. He can be violent, but he's very well trained. He's a bit of a planner. Jake is like the loose cannon. He's like the one that, the fist fighter. And while Steven is the thinker, the analyzer. And what I love as well about what you did with this novel is because of taking Mark out, where you've got Jake and Steven basically at ends with each other, with Khonshu as a pseudo mediator. it really
He
amplifies
tries.
them. He tries his best, but it amplifies their two conflicting personalities, which I think is one of the, in more modern Moon Knight, where they leaned more into dissociative identity disorder, and especially what they do in the MCU, showing that the differences do make them clash, but when they work together, it can be an unstoppable force. And I think that where I am in the book, again, about a third through or so, you've got, I think they had the conversation where Jake is like, why would you ever learn these things? And he's like, but Jake, you don't know anything about anything. You don't know any movie references. You have, apart from your own little world, you essentially don't know anything else. And I think at one point, like, Jake makes a joking reference to something and Stephen was like, have you even seen that movie? Like, do you even know what you're referencing? Because they're so opposite. And I think the humor of it, again, comes from their conflicting personalities, and Khonshu almost being like, guys, can you know you've got something to do, right? Can you do the
shut
thing?
up already.
Which that
was, when I talk about unlikely friendships, like that's really like, in if they were separate people, Stephen Grant and Jake Lockley would never encounter each other, other than like maybe Stephen would take a cab, but probably not in Jake's neighborhood. So that's fun, like where they're forced together and they're forced to recognize like the traits of them. When I tried to look at, we might have talked about this last time. I am a huge fan of like the original Mission Impossible TV series. And especially like the reboot show that was, I think it only lasted 2 seasons in like the mid 80s, but that was like really formative for me. And I love the idea of a team, and like, so each person has a specialty. And so I looked at Moon Knight as like, Mark is kind of like the strategist with the military experience. So he's like, okay, I know how this goes down. And then Jake is like the muscle who, like you said, goes loose cannon, but also can just like fight his way through stuff. And then Steven is like I'm going to get information by going to this gala or going to like this fundraiser or whatever. And so they all really balance each other out. Like they all need each other to kind of get the job done. And so the idea is just like removing pieces from that and watching like them struggle to like recalibrate their own sense of identity and relationship with their.
And in line with that, did you find of the characters, because obviously different perspectives, was there one that either you really preferred writing or one that was really difficult to write? I know you said Venom writing in second person was challenging, but did you have that with like, was there any character that once you got to writing them, you were like, I can't wait to come back to this, or were they all kind of played into things that you enjoyed of writing?
I think Steven's probably the most fun to write because he is first person. So his voice is stronger because of the Oscar Isaac performance. So that's, as a writer, dialogue is my natural strength. So that was probably the most fun to write. I would say like Steven and Venom, because they're outside of like the traditional third person point of view.
And Venom's all dialogue, basically. In some respects.
Which is really nice to like get through a chapter where it's like, I don't have to describe this. It's just Venom being pissed off.
It's one of those, because I thoroughly enjoyed this, and I really can't wait. I do want to ask, because we're starting to get near the wrap up time, but we've still got a bit more time to go. But I want to ask, with Moon Knight, but before you wrote this book, was Jake your favorite? Because I know that your dog is named Jake the dog after Jake from Adventure Time, Jake Lockley, and another Jake. Is he your favorite of the Moon Knight characters? Sort of I know obviously in the MCU series he's essentially not in it, he's right at the very end.
Yeah.
But did you already like Jake from your peripheral knowledge of Moon Knight, or did you have a favorite character before writing this on the Moon Knight sort of?
No, I mean, before I really got to know Moon Knight, I mean, like it was primarily Marc Spector. And then with the show, like I got to know Stephen Grant more. But I found with this, and then like deep diving into the Moon Knight catalog, and there's some really great character work done with Jake Lockley from 2016 onward. I remember, like, my editor wrote that she made a note in the manuscript like, Jake is my baby and I just want to protect him. So it's like I think like you really see, like, you have Stephen Grant who's saying like, oh, I've been all over the world. I've talked with like all these different like, professors and philosophers and, moguls. And like, I see so much more of the world. And then Jake's like, that's not the real world, man. And I think like that's really, really fun to write. But I think it's really authentic too, because like I mean, especially today where like information travels so fast, like you can just get lost in like the high level perspective. And then you forget that, like, wait a minute, I can just help out in my community. And that's enough. Um, and I really tried to push that forward with Jake, where like yes, he uses his fists, but like there's a reason why his network of homeless informants, like why they trust him, and it's because he looks out for them. And I really wanted to push that forward and make him a sympathetic character that way. But in terms of my dog, no, we named him after I completed this project.
Amazing stuff. And I want to ask as well, because you mentioned exposition earlier, and that's one thing that I found that because I'm such a massive, I've done, full on deep dives into Venom and Moon Knight's history and things. So I already knew all of this. I actually didn't find the exposition was heavy handed or anything. I didn't really think about it when I went in, but I was like, even though we spoke about it, when I started reading, I was like, oh yeah, you're going to have to essentially reintroduce, because everyone I think thinks they know Venom, but everyone knows a different iteration of Venom, because
90s Venom is way different from modern Venom.
100%, yeah. And even modern Venom in comics is very different to Tom Hardy's Venom. Different, right, but still, and it's such an interesting thing and even video game Venom is very different, because video game Venom, from what I played, he was very much an antagonist a lot of the time, as more so than a kind of anti-hero. But then I think Moon Knight is still quite a fringe character in a lot of ways. I mean, I was so surprised they decided to make an MCU series on it. I mean, I'm really so happy, because as you say, Oscar Isaac knocks it out of the park. It's actually probably my favorite of the MCU shows, I think. Either that or Loki, but I like them all for different reasons. But that was probably my favorite. And so with the exposition, like, did you get many notes from editors? Was that like quite a big conversation, considering what you've already sort of mentioned in who the audience is, what you can draw upon? Like, was exposition quite a big part of the conversation to try and get those levels?
I think this is where, having written for IP several times and several different IPs, like I think I have a better understanding of how to parse it out. So it was actually the only thing we really talked about was like how much or like what level of depth is needed. But in terms of like spreading it out and making it more natural, also being a science fiction writer, like you kind of learn not to like front load the exposition. When I do some feedback readings for newer writers, and I will see this really common thing for science fiction writers where like they will load like the first 5 pages with like complete descriptions of their universe and the government systems and the types of ships and stuff, and I'm like, no, you can't do that. Like,
you're not Tolkien.
Yeah, exactly. So like you learn to understand like what's essential to like the scene only, and then like I personally like make a list of points that have to be understood by like a certain part of the book, usually like in the first 25%. And so I will take those points, and then when I'm first drafting, like I usually don't get to them. But then when I go and revisit the first 25%, then I'll be like, okay, these are the points that like, have I naturally addressed it through dialogue and action? If not, I got to stick it in somewhere, and I have to space it out so you're not feeling like, someone's just reading you a Wikipedia entry.
That's the thing. That's the tough thing. And I think with a lot of films nowadays, people seem to trip up on that. I mean, there's a lot of content people trip up on, but I notice it in films where you've kind of got, someone walks into like a kitchen and goes, "Oh, hello, sister of mine. How is your back doing from that operation you had the other day?" And you're like, no one talks like that. But when you add in normally,
I always think about, there was this behind the scenes thing from like when the first X-Files movie came out. And it's Gillian Anderson and David Duchovny just joking about how much exposition they had to say to each other in like the first 10 minutes of the movie. And then Gillian Anderson was like, I got the really hard stuff because like I'm on the phone with Mulder explaining this situation, but also saying things like, we've worked together for the past 5 years and I've seen all sorts of crazy things with you. But Mulder gets a scene like shortly after that where he's drunk and just explaining his life story to a woman in a bar, and he gets to play it for comedy. And so Jillian was like, you had fun with yours. Like I just had to talk and make it not sound terrible. And like, I always think about that with spacing out exposition. Like they had 2 very like unnecessarily loaded scenes to hit like every broad demographic possible. And I'm in a book, you have way more space to work with that. So I try to keep that in mind.
Yeah, and with the writing, you can, as you say, you can write a full draft with almost no exposition, and then you can kind of go back and slot it in certain respects. But with a film, it's like you can't, without reshoots, you can't really do that. And then the more you reshoot, generally, the messier things get.
You need Gillian Anderson on a phone walking and just explaining how the X-Files works.
Yeah, just those people who want to watch the X-Files movie who've not seen the series. Who I don't know anyone who would, but the execs always think about that. They go, oh, if we make a movie of the series, people have, we have to make sure that people can watch the movie without watching the series. And you're like, but who's going to want to watch it? It's one of those very odd decisions there. But I think in this it was done very, very well. And I think the brilliance of it is because even in one of the canons, I don't think Venom and Marc Spector have ever really interacted anyway. They might have done, like I've read most of their stuff. I don't remember.
But 2 years ago, they when it was Dylan and Venom, like they had like I think a 2-issue like partnership where they were trying to figure something out together in New York. But there is a Venom What If miniseries that's happening right now where Venom joins with like different characters. And one of them is Marc Spector. And that one came out like, I think a month or 2 months ago. And like, I did not read it. I'm like, I don't, until I have this book like fully behind me, then I will check it out. But like, I don't want to go there right now.
Well, it makes sense, especially when you're doing some press. You don't want to inadvertently, almost not quite cross things, but you know what I mean? Like they are separate, but they are somewhat connected. But it's like Moon Knight, like his early days, he's got 1 or 2 comics with Spider-Man, like in his before he kind of had his own series where he was just in Werewolf by Night and here and there. And so I know they'd interacted, but I think that with the exposition element, what's great is that because they've not, aside from What If stories, because they've never really interacted, you've kind of got, when you have exposition, it actually works because there's Venom that goes, oh, I can see this memory of yours when you did this. That's not going to help you now. And it's like, that comment gives exposition, but I think the trick to, I'm not a writer, obviously, but I think the trick to exposition is making it natural. It's not just saying the exposition. And it's kind of with the idea of like Chekhov's smoking gun, because I rewatched Aliens 2 nights ago, one of my favorite films ever. And what I love about Aliens is at the start of the movie, Ripley uses the mech suit, and she doesn't just use it and then nothing happens. The reason she gets in it is to prove to the Marines that she has value. She's not just a random civilian. So when you see her use the mech suit, in the confines of the story, in your mind you go, oh, the mech suit is to show she's valuable to the team. You then get Hicks go, oh, there's more to this person than I thought. And then you don't think about the mech suit again. But when it pops up, you go, oh, she already knows how to do that. And I think that's the trick to either exposition or making it so this character knows how to do X, Y, Z, is that you have to either have it into natural conversation, or a lot of the time really there's got to be
a payoff.
Exactly, without it being obvious.
One thing I actually do in my drafting is I leave, like, I put a bracket in there and I put in like callback later. And that's like when I search for those brackets, like that's part of my like checklist of things to do to finish off a manuscript. It's like make sure like certain things planted in the first half get called back later, so they have like they really hit with more emotional resonance.
That's a good shout. So we're getting towards the end of our time. I do want to speak about Quantum Love Story very briefly. But before we sort of tease with that at the end, is there anything else about this novel of yours that I haven't touched upon that you'd like to just say a few words on?
I think, okay, without spoilers. So this is not connected to the MCU show. However, without spoilers, I will say by the midpoint of this book, fans of the MCU show are going to be super, super, super happy for some very specific reasons.
That's very good fun. I'm glad. It's actually it's hyped me up even more because I've got my tablet right next to me, so I'm like I have been reading each night, and I'm very excited to read more. I know when we spoke before, I was so excited, so I cannot
message me when you will know when you get to what I'm talking about. You should message me when you do that.
Oh, I will 100%. I'll message you when I get to that point, and then when I finish, I'll put a little post online. I'll leave a review and stuff like that because it's so much fun, and then maybe when we have another conversation in the future before recording, I can talk a little bit about that. But yeah, no, I really recommend it, everyone listening. I was lucky enough to get an early reader's copy, so I've been reading that. But it's already out by the time of this conversation being recorded. I'll put links in the description and stuff to where you can find it and things like that. Also, a shout out again to my friend Scott, who did the essay collection Waxing and Waning from Sequart. I really recommend that because it's people writing about Moon Knight and their own perspectives and stuff on it. A lot of people. There's an individual in that who has DID, dissociative identity disorder, part of the Douglas Vincent system. I've had them on my podcast actually to talk about DID, experiencing it. So that's a really interesting thing. Details of that will be in the description for anyone listening who's interested. But before we let Mike go, I am going to have you on to talk about Quantum Love Story and probably Vampire Weekend in more depth. But I just want to say that I read Quantum Love Story and I absolutely loved it. I'll ask you one question, then we'll start to wrap up, which is, I found that this book, Quantum Love Story, was brilliant. It was really page-turning. It was unique in the way it did the time loop, but it felt familiar enough that it wasn't like almost a shot in the dark. Now, I recall, I think from looking up bioinformation of you or hearing other podcasts that you were on, that you have an engineering degree.
Yes.
Did you find that the character of Carter was inspired in any way by your engineering or even the book itself? Is there any thread between Quantum Love Story and engineering? Without spoilers, because we'll do a conversation in the future about it. But I'm just interested if at all, or if I'm just creating things from nothing.
So in the book, there's two perspective characters. There's Carter, who is kind of like this failed technician who really just wants to be a chef. But he's working at this quantum accelerator. And then there's Mariana, who is like this brilliant scientist, but is thinking about leaving science because her best friend just died and she can't figure out how to process that. But she decides that she's going to do one more job and do like this consulting gig at this accelerator. And then this big explosion happens and they get stuck in a time loop together. I realized that a lot of the relationships in my books, and this is very subconscious, and every writer will probably tell you something similar, is like it's a reflection of me and my wife. My wife is very much like Carter, in that like she's much more like go with the flow, and like she's a super foodie. All of Carter's food stuff in that book comes directly from her. Like I do not care about food at all. And I'm very like scientific and methodical, and like even in my writing, I'm like very much like, I mean, I talked about spreadsheets and lists here. Like that's how I design my plots. And so in a way, I'm very much more like the Mariana side of things, where I'm very engineering. And this is a reflection of like two people with like different types of personalities coming together because they find that they fit each other. And so there is both some conscious and subconscious reflections of my own marriage.
Yeah, I did think, because I remember from our last conversation we spoke about food and music and things. You're super passionate about music, and your wife is more passionate about food. And when I was reading it, I was like, this sounds like Mike has been speaking to his wife and asking her questions about certain foodie things, which I really liked, because I was like, I remember Mike saying he's not that fast, so I feel like that specific thing, like how you cook this thing was.
It's funny. Like when my wife, like when she listened to the audiobook, she goes like, this thing where like, they talk about like they have extra time and they have extra money, so he's just going to order like 5 breakfasts every day. And she's like, you're making fun of me, aren't you? Like, I'm not making fun of you. I just know that you would do that, because sometimes like when we go to a restaurant, my wife will be like, well, let's get one extra thing to take home because I want to try it tomorrow. And I'm like, really? Like, okay, that's fine. Like, I'm full. I've had my sustenance. I'm fine. But yeah, sure, go for it.
It's amazing. And one of the things I'll say to people is with Quantum Love Story, obviously I love Star Wars Brotherhood, hugely say people should go out and pick that up. But also, it's good to pick up novels from authors that aren't just IPs from, giant corporations. As much we love the content from giant corporations, and that what this podcast has been about is promoting that, that I've been trying my best to, when I have authors on to do a Star Wars or whatever, I try and pick up at least one of their other pieces of content that is more original. I love Quantum Love Story, and one thing I'll say about it is, even though the title has the word love story in it, it is in no way predictable, and it doesn't go the way people think. Yeah. Which is really what you want from a story like that. And I won't say anything else because any hints will potentially spoil things, but it's a really great book. It flows amazingly. And I think the length of it works, because there's a part nearer the end act where things change and one character takes the lead a little bit. And when that happened, I was like, this isn't where I thought things were going. And I liked the middle section before, for lack of a better word, shit gets real. I like the middle section where it's just kind of them being together, and that was really nice. We call that
fun and games in the writer world.
I think one of the reasons I love your writing so much is because although you do write great stories and there's a lot of interesting things from a narrative perspective, as we've sort of been speaking about in this conversation, you're very character driven, and I love getting invested in characters, and when you know what the characters want and really what they need to make themselves whole and they don't know what it is, I love that because you're kind of like shouting at the page like, when will you be happy? When will you get? You only need to do these two things, and you'll have everything you want. And then things keep getting in the way. And so the fun and games element, where I think the characters are really self-actualizing in a lot of ways. They're really they're having their own moments in their lives to kind of be like, oh, I'm like this, or I'm like that. I need to work on this, or I need to work on that. And I love that bit, and I love the ending. I love how it all works together, but I thought it was an absolutely fantastic novel. And if anyone has read any of other Mike Chen stuff, pick up What If, because we're promoting that right now. But if you can pick up anything else, Quantum Love Story, I genuinely really loved it.
Thank you. And in terms of like other like Star Wars authors, I'm going to shout out like Delilah Dawson has several books that like one comes out in a few weeks. No, actually it comes out next week. Or not next week. It comes out the same day as mine. Huh. She has a horror book coming out this week, and she had another release earlier this week. So please support Delilah S. Dawson. She is the best Star Wars mentor I could ask for. Oh,
that's so sweet. I'm wanting to. I have not reached out to her or anything like that, but I want to get her on at some point because she wrote Phasma, which people may need to see behind. Oh, wrong side. I've not mirrored it, so I'm really, really bad. I keep pointing in the wrong place. I've got Phasma here, which I loved, and then I also read Black Spy Outpost, which is the sort of spiritual successor before I went to Galaxy's Edge. It's one of my favorite Star Wars books, and I thought it was just going to be, when I heard about it, I was like, supporting Galaxy's Edge, it's not going to be that amazing, I don't know. And I read it, I was like, this is one of my favorite Star Wars books. I thought,
the thing is, like, every Star Wars book is a piece of capitalism. Like, whether it's like, supporting Galaxy's Edge or supporting, the Obi-Wan Kenobi show or whatever, it's like, it's all promotion. So, but you get the writers who love the IP enough that like they can take something that's essentially a promotional item and turn it into a really meaningful exploration of like the elements involved with, because I mean, Star Wars is all IPs we love are like super creative. So even though they're being meant to, make money for giant corporations, like we can create life out of them, much like the dark side of the Force.
Very good. Yeah, very, very nicely put. And I'll say also of Delilah's book, it made me excited to meet Vi Maraudy in Galaxy's Edge, which I did, and I've got a photo with her, which I was very excited for. And Ethan Sachs also wrote a Galaxy's Edge comic miniseries as well, which is really fun. I read that a couple years back, and that really helped with Galaxy's Edge too. So, all great authors, all amazing individuals, including yourself, Mike Chen. So, as we wrap up this call, thank you again for your time. Tell people where they can find you. Last few things as a shout out and your last sort of statements and things. I'll put everything in the description, but the floor is yours for the end of this call.
So I am Mike Chen, writer on all social media accounts. As of this recording, I am mostly on Threads. I was on Blue Sky for a while, and then I moved to Threads because there weren't enough people on Blue Sky. But I hear like they seem to be jockeying for position for like the text-based social media. So on one of them, you will find me. I'm Mike Chen, writer on Instagram, where you will see a lot of photos of Jake the dog. Who's a very good boy. He's being a snarty teenager right now, but he's a very good boy. I have this book. I have 2 books that are coming out in 2026. One is a space opera. One is a YA book. I will promote those later. And then one other very secret project that hopefully I will be able to talk about in the coming months.
Very exciting stuff. And when that all happens, come on the pod again and we'll talk about all those things.
Absolutely.
Amazing stuff. Well, friends, thank you so much for listening. As always, all the details in the description, as I already said, but pick up What If Marc Spector was host to Venom. I'll put details in the description and all that jazz, and pick up Waxing and Waning if you could as well. But thank you so much for listening, and we'll speak to you very soon. And that's the end of the podcast. Thank you so much for tuning in. As always, my friends, make sure you check out Mike's book, What If Marc Spector Was Host to Moon Knight, as well as his other novels that I mentioned. You can listen to them on Audible. If you've never listened on there, you can just get a free trial and get 1 free credit. Or you can pick up the ebook or pick up the physical book the old-fashioned way, like I do. I like having the physical book in front of me. But please follow Mike Chen on Instagram and Threads, and also check out his website, which are in the description. And if you enjoyed this conversation, if you've not tuned in before, please check out episode 234 of Genuine Chit-Chat, which was released in May 2024, where myself and Mike spoke about Star Wars Brotherhood. It was kind of his introduction to the show, and also he spoke about some of his other works in a bit more detail. So a nice wider scope of Mike's works. And if you're a fan of Moon Knight, please check out the Moon Knight essay collection, Waxing and Waning. It was released by Sequart, and it was edited and put together by Scott Weatherly. Now, I spoke with Scott. I've also had Tony Farina on the show. He's a good friend of the show, as is Scott. And I've also had Lena on the show. Lena is part of the Douglas Vincent system, and Douglas Vincent is an individual who has DID, Dissociative Identity Disorder, which is the thing that Moon Knight actually has. And Lena was a consultant on Jed McKay's recent Moon Knight run. So if you want to hear my conversation with someone who actually has Dissociative Identity Disorder and talk about Moon Knight a bit, please check out my episode with Lena, which was episode 235, so right after the Mike Chen conversation. And I've got a future conversation for release with another member of the Douglas Vincent system. That will be with Louise, and then I've got future ones coming out as well. Now, if you're a really big fan of Star Wars, obviously check out the conversation with Mike Chen to hear about Star Wars Brotherhood, but also check out Clone Wars Conversations. That's when myself, Dave, and Math go through episodes of the Clone Wars. Now, Dave and me have seen the Clone Wars through before, but Math never has, so it's his first time experiencing that. So it's really great, and you can watch along, or you can just listen with us. And our more recent episodes have been hyper-focusing on specific arcs in a lot more detail, so we can talk about them at length. I've also spoke to numerous other Star Wars authors. I've spoken to Cavan Scott, George Mann, Claudia Gray, Adam Christopher, Kevin Shinnick, Ethan Sachs, and also Mary Kenny. She's amazing. She released a Star Wars short story in a certain point of view, Return of the Jedi. So however you found yourself into this conversation, whether you're a Moon Knight fan or a Venom fan or a Star Wars fan or a Mike Chen fan, any of those things, I have spoken about those things at length. I've spoken about Carnage at length on the Spider Down the Secret Wars podcast. We spoke about Maximum Carnage as well as Absolute Carnage as well. So like anything nerdy, I've probably spoken about to some degree. So please hit that subscribe button. Please follow me on all the social media places at Genuine Chit-Chat. Please, if you enjoyed this conversation, please leave a review wherever you're listening, as this is an independent show, so it really, really helps get that reach out. Make sure you sign up to the Pop Culture Collective newsletter as well, and link is in the description. You get a weekly newsletter talking about all kinds of stuff that's going on the pop culture sort of nerdy side, nerdy sphere. So a lot of movie announcements and trailers and comic stuff and podcast releases, things like that. And I also contribute weekly as well. So you get a little description and artwork of what I've got going on each week. So please subscribe to that if you desire at pccnewsletter.com. And finally, if you really enjoyed this conversation, please consider supporting on Patreon. For as little as £1 a month, you get immediate access to over 250 bonus episodes, normally where myself and my wife Megan review a multitude of things every week. So usually it's films, sometimes it's TV series, live performances we've seen, a couple of holidays we've been on, things like that. But you'll get one episode of those every single week. They're normally 10 to 15 minutes long, so really easy and bite-sized, and we do a whole host of things. And at the moment, we are in spooky season. So the franchise of this year is the Alien franchise. Last year, we watched every single Nightmare on Elm Street film. Yes, all of them and the remake. And we had a great old time doing that. The year before that, I think we did all the Scream movies. And then this year, we are focusing on Alien. We've also done a lot of other films. We watched Friday the 13th, a couple of Jordan Peele movies. We watched a couple of classic movies like Psycho, things like that. We try and mix it up every spooky season. And in October, we also release episodes every 2 or 3 days to Patreon supporters. So you get even more episodes. So if you want to consider supporting the show in a financial way and getting loads of bonus content, please consider going over to patreon.com/genuinechitchat. But if you can't help in that way, please share, review, rate, follow and subscribe. But friends, thank you so much for tuning in. As always, I appreciate you all. I'll speak to you in the future. I think next week might actually be the conversation with Louise of the Douglas Vincent system. So that'll be sort of a continuation of my conversation with Lena. And then following those, I've got a Disney discussions recorded about Tron and Tron Legacy. And then after that will probably be another episode of Clone Wars Conversations. And I've got a lot of other cool things coming up. I've recently did a recording of Back to the Filmography. I've got a few things of Spider-Man planned. I've got loads of great things. So just make sure you follow me on the social media places. Instagram and Threads are places where I am the most active. Instagram is probably the number one place, especially keep an eye on my stories because sometimes they have hints to things that I am doing as well. But I appreciate you listening all the way to the very end, whether you're a new listener or a returning subscriber, but hopefully this will turn everyone into a returning subscriber. But I will speak to you all very soon and I hope you have a wonderful day.
You have just experienced host, creator, everything elser of Genuine Chit-Chat, and also the host and creator of Star Wars Comics in Canon, found on the Comics in Motion podcast, Mike Burton.